Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is my best reads of 2020. Slightly different this year from previous years because I can't honestly say I've got like a top 10 reads of the year that I can order from 1 to 10. All 10 of these are easily my sort of best reads of the year, but all of them have flaws in some way. Last year was the Lost Children archive, the year before that was Milkman, which to me they do have flaws, but they are so beautifully and brilliantly written that those flaws don't register. Whereas with these books, as good as they were, unfortunately the flaws did register. So even though I gave them 5 stars, because that's just part of how I rate books, I can't put them in the same category of book as Lost Children archive and Milkman. And a way of conceptualising those is those books would get to my all-time top 20 books, whereas none of these would. But you know, that's not to say that these aren't worthwhile reading. They absolutely are. But I can't order them from 1 to 10 because there's no clear and obvious difference that just would elevate one straight to number 1 and 1 to number 2, etc, etc, etc. So it's been a slightly strange reading year, and not just because of COVID. But anyway, on with the books. So the first one I'm going to talk about is The Blind Light by Stuart Evers, a British writer. Before I start talking about the books, I just want to say at the end of this video I'll give my stats for the year, breakdown of books, fiction, non-fiction, all that sort of stuff. So this is just a really, really good piece of storytelling. It's two unlikely guys, one from the aristocracy, one from the working class. He works in the Dagenham Ford factory, but they're brought together in the north of England when they're conscripted. They have to do their national service, and they form an unlikely friendship, but it is an interesting study of class and difference and exploitation. But the sort of metaphor that runs throughout the book is it's set against the background of the nuclear threat. It starts in the sort of 1950s, just after the war, and runs up to sort of the end of the 20th century. And while they're on national service, one of their training things is a town has been mocked up as if it's been hit by a nuclear device, and they have to go and train on that site. But it's chilling, you know, the amount of detail that's been sort of provided into recreating the likely destruction. So all this creative energy has been poured into creating something that is all about destruction. And then we have sort of, you know, backdrops of nuclear scares of Cube and Missile Crisis, you know, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and all these sorts of things. It keeps coming back as a backdrop to the relationship of these two guys and their families. It's essentially a family drama, but really interesting how it's constantly interwoven in and out of the nuclear threat. On to Robert Perisic, a Croatian writer. This is Our Man in Iraq, which is his debut novel, which came out a couple of years ago, maybe. And this is superb. This was really, really good. It's about a Croatian journalist who moves from the countryside to Zagreb, where his newspaper is. And Croatia has changed radically, gone through so many changes in just 15 years, from state socialist or communist, if you want to call it that, through to punishing civil war and an ethnic war, through to, as part of that, being ruled by the remnants of the Second World War crypto-fascist government that was basically a Nazi puppet state. Those guys, some of those guys, and certainly their ideas are still around, and came to power in Croatia when it won its independence, and there was sort of support was hardened up by the ongoing civil war, and then when they finally fell away and were replaced by democracy. So it's gone through all these changes, and the book is essentially sort of, you know, considering all of that, you know, in the light of Croatia once made the news when it was at the heart of the Yugoslavian civil war. And now it's struggling for its identity, having had so many changes. What is Croatia? What is its place in the world? So the man in Iraq is this guy, the journalist, sends a nephew of his who can speak Arabic out to Iraq to cover the war there. But no one cares what Croatia thinks about the Iraq war. It doesn't count for anything. And this guy, feeling increasingly redundant out there, sends these increasingly surreal and existentialist reports on war and life and death. And they can't be used in a newspaper, they're too flowery, so the journalist back in Zagreb cuts them down. But it's, as I say, it's really about, sort of what is Croatia, where does it stand? And it was fabulous, really punchy, funny, acerbic, and I'm looking forward to reading his novel that came out this year called Signal Area. And from the same region, Milorad Pavic, a Serbian writer. This is the Dictionary of the Khazars, a lexicon novel. It's basically about an imaginary or a disappeared people called the Khazars from, I guess, sort of Middle Ages thereafter, in the sort of Balkans, Caucasus area. And it's trying to sort of preserve their culture through compiling a dictionary of key people, fables, etc. And the Khazars were their own people with their own sort of values and sort of philosophies, but each were claimed as being converts by Jews, Muslims and Christians in the region. So a lot of the contributions here, and this is presented as 3 dictionaries in a way, an Islamic one, a Jewish one and a Christian one, and each is sort of slightly propagandised to claim that the Khazars sort of converted to them, where in fact it seems the Khazars very much kept their independence. That's part of why they've sort of disappeared without trace. And it's just very inventive, it's fabulous storytelling. Normally I'm not into sort of founding myths and fables, but it works here, it's really, really beautifully done. And talking of beautifully done, W.G. Sebald, The Rings of Saturn. So last year I read his book The Immigrants as my introduction to his work, but this takes it up to a whole new level. This is such a beguiling piece of work. It's basically a character of Sebald who decides he's going to walk throughout Norfolk, the county of Norfolk, over the course of the year. And at the end of that journey, he ends up in hospital because he's overdone it. And while he's lying in hospital, the only thing he can see, because he's flat on his back, is a skylight above, which literally frames the only view he has of the sky and the clouds. And it's that sort of shrunken, fixed frame provides the metaphor for him guiding us through what he sees on his walk, because there's a lot of stuff about things that have disappeared from Norfolk. So a grand hotel which has now fallen on hard times, the mackerel fishing fleet which no longer is in service, so all these trawlers are just left rusting on the sand and stuff. And we also get meditations on not only on the mackerel fishing industry, but on mackerel's sort of lifespan and habits and mating and all this sort of stuff. There's one on the German silkworm industry and how the Nazis tried to reintroduce it. And so there's lots of these sort of meditations of lost things, disappeared things. So it is very melancholic, but it's so beguiling. It's wonderful. And George Pavic, W, or The Memory of Childhood. So this was my second Pavic of the year, and my third in all. Earlier in the year I read Life, a User's Manual, which is a buddy read with Celia, and we were so taken with it, we said, fancy another one, because she had this on her shelf, so I ordered it, and buddy read this as well. And this takes on Life, a User's Manual to the nth degree. It's not related to it in any way, but just, as gobsmackingly, brilliant as that was, this goes on to an even higher level, even though it's a very short book and a slightly odd book in a way. It's two different narratives. The first is of a child who is always moved from relative to relative and is desperately sort of trying to settle down, find his roots. Whenever he consults a photo, even if there's the date and place written on the back of it, it doesn't accord with his memory because he has no stability, no frame of reference that's fixed for him to refer back to. So he's in this constant state of flux. And the second story is a guy who has had to adopt a false persona and has sort of managed to sort of drop out from society, being aware of his existence. He gets a note that this guy wants to meet him, that this guy has found out his false identity. So he meets with this guy and he sort of says, well, I know the true, or I knew the true person whose identity you stole. And he was a young child who died the other side of the world. He was drowned in a sort of sinking boat. And you need to go there to find out exactly what happened to him, you know, to sort of complete this tale. So the guy goes to the nearest island, which turns out to be run along the lines of the Olympics or something very similar. It's all about sort of sporting. The whole society is about sort of sporting competition, and there are these very regimented rules about training and about clothing and about moving through the various strata within the society. But they also seem to get increasingly chaotic and random. And what you realise is, and I don't think this is a spoiler, what you realise is that this is a metaphor for Nazi Germany and the rules and restrictions that they introduced, which, you know, very rule-bound, and yet within that allowed a huge amount of chaos and violence and randomness. And that ties back to the child who has no identity, because he's a Jewish child who has constantly moved around to keep him safe. And it's just brilliant how it all comes together. It is slightly odd, though, this sort of island of Olympic folk. It slightly sort of takes you aback, because the tone of the book, the rest of the book, is quite realist, and this is slightly absurd. And on to Dark Spring by Khazars, who was a German surrealist painter, ostensibly, who wrote poems, but she did write 2 novellas and a novel. And this is really dark, as befits its title. It's about a 12-year-old girl who is out of sorts with the world. You know, she views her birth as a mistake, really, because, you know, she can't get hold of her father's love because he's always away. He's on sort of colonial business before the First World War, and then he serves in the First World War. And after the war, he's still trying to do trade with these former German colonies. So she's very much left to her own devices, and she's sexually assaulted by her brother, and she has this crush on this guy around a sort of communal swimming pool, but so do all the girls. So she very much sort of pulls back and stays in the background, doesn't make her feelings for this guy as obvious as some of the other girls. But it's just really, really dark, and the ending is a real blow to the gut. I love this book. I think the only reason I wouldn't ever sort of put it in my top 20 is because it's very short. It's a novella of about 60 pages, which wouldn't automatically rule it out. But just if it had been a novel of greater length and sustained that level of through it, then I would consider putting it in my all-time top 20. But still a great read. Love and Other Thought Experiments by Sophie Ward, a British author. This is her debut. She is best known as an actress, and I almost, if you put a gun to my head and said you have to pick a book of the year, this would probably be it. It is let down by chapters 2 and 3, which is the reason why, again, it's slightly flawed to my mind. But ignoring that, so it's a lesbian partnership. And one of the partners is an academic and an intellectual. The other's a bit more earthy and homey. And there's a sort of crunch point in their relationship where the earthy one wants to have a child, wants in vitro fertilisation. And the academic knows that this is going to be the make or break of their relationship. So she's sort of pondering what she's going to do, how she's going to respond. And they're in bed at night one night, and the earthy one is sort of jolted awake because she has the sensation of an ant is crawling over her face. And in that sort of lurching movement awake, the ant is sort of knocked into her aqueous humour of her eye. And her partner's going, no, that's ridiculous, that can't happen, it can't get into your eye. So again, the sort of difference and the division in their relationship. And yet it's also so tender because she decides that, you know, well, even if this is insane, I will care and treat her and respond to her as if it was true. So she has made the compromise of her own beliefs out of pure love for her partner. And that also determines, she realises that means that, yeah, we're going to have a child together as well. Then you have Lane chapters 2 and 3, which I'm not going to talk about. But then we get into the heart of the book. So the next chapter is from the point of view of the ant inside, the brain of the earthy woman. And it's brilliantly done. Normally you think, oh, you know, anthropomorphism, yada yada, but it's actually brilliantly done. And the ant can taste the sweetness of the tumour that's developing inside her, because, and this is not a spoiler, they have the child, but she dies when the child's very young. And that leads into the rest of the book, which is a book about mothers and sons. Not only the mother who's still living and her son, but also the son's search to fill the space of his dead mother, of the earthy woman. And it's done in different genres, you know, there's sort of sci-fi and stuff, and sort of future projections. And, you know, it is really effective. And the whole thing is tied together by the thought experiments. Each chapter starts with a thought experiment, such as what's the difference between how animals think and how humans think, and things like that. Just as a whole, it works. You know, you may think as how I've described it, it wouldn't work, but it absolutely works. And it's so tender. It's a supreme study of love, both for the love of the two women for each other and their love for their child. Wonderful. Alice Knott by Blake Butler. So Alice Knott is a woman of inherited wealth who invests in paintings and has them in a vault in her house. And there is a break-in, and they've all been stolen. And a viral video soon is in circulation of one of the paintings being set fire to. And this sets off a sort of copycat behaviour around the world where paintings are stolen from galleries and set fire to. So all of a sudden, art is no longer immortal. It is as mortal as human beings are. And of course, art tries to sort of overcome the mortality of human beings by, you know, being timeless and all that sort of stuff. She replaces one of the missing paintings with a huge mirror, and she's studying herself in the mirror. And we get this sort of, you know, in the same way as you would study a portrait or a painting on a wall, she is studying herself and all the different aspects of her face that she can no longer recognise. They've been locked out. She's been locked out from them of her previous, you know, earlier ages. She can only confront how she is now in the mirror. And the book is a fascinating character study. You know, was it she herself who arranged for the paintings to be stolen and burnt them? Had she become tired of them? There are all these sort of strange aspects of character whereby she goes to somebody else's art show and see all the paintings that she takes to be of her mother. Her father, she says, was disappeared and replaced with another man, but she's the only person who seems to be able to detect this, that her mother and no one else are aware of this. And then the original father comes back and replaces the other guy, and again, no one bats an eyelid or says anything. She has a sick brother, ill brother, who she never sees, but he is in the room next to hers moving about, but she's never allowed to see him. And then when he grows into an adult, he is healthy and is a serial killer. So is it he who's behind the theft and the destruction of art? There are all these sorts of things which sound a bit odd on the face of it, but actually lead to a really incredibly deep, detailed psychological study of this character, Alice Knott, in a really interesting and provocative way. The only shortcoming of the book is I do feel Butler goes back and repeats himself in trying to express and establish certain emotional states or pieces of identity in Alice Knott. So I feel there's a bit of repetition in there. But despite that, it's a really good read. But I think Blake Butler is an acquired taste. I've acquired the taste. I wouldn't start with this, but it is worthwhile if you decide you like Butler's writing. And the final two I don't have. One, because it doesn't exist other than as a PDF or online. It's called The Provisional Biography of Moise Eakins by Evan Dara, writer of The Lost Scrapbook. And it's available from his website or his publisher's website as a download. And it's written in the form of a stage play, but I don't think it was ever written in order to be performed. I think that is the stylistic choice that Dara has made. And it's a story of this guy called Moise Eakins, who goes into his office, middle management, goes into his office and he's assailed on all sides by his workmates, firing questions at him. Some of them are to do with the business and professional, others are personal questions, how's your weekend, etc., how the kids, all this sort of, not kids, but those types of questions. So you get all these sort of, diverse questions that almost form a sort of a mosaic. And he answers them all, each one in turn. But what you realise very quickly is that the words he imagines him and hears himself saying are not the words that other people are hearing. That actually it's as meaningless as trying to put all these answers together into a coherent, speech or speech narrative. That people don't hear him as he hears himself. There are only two characters who he's able to communicate with. One is his girlfriend, and she doesn't understand his words, but because they are, intimates, they have other languages other than just verbal. They have obviously body language and sexual language and all these sorts of things. So they are able to communicate. And the other one is a street food vendor who, when Eakins places his order verbally what he wants to eat, hands over the money, the guy serves him what he wants. But that's the only communication that works where there is equality on both sides in terms of communicability and understandability. And I think that is the theme of this book. It's all about the degradation and the corruption of language under the forces of capitalism and exchange and transaction, that language works for that on a one-to-one correlation. But beyond that, when you're trying to do with emotions and relationships that aren't transactional, language has been corrupted because it only works on a transactional level. It's a really interesting, it's very short, it's only about 89 pages, but I thought it was fabulous. And the other book I don't have is the second book I read this year, and when I read it I thought it's going to be hard to knock this off the top perch. And that is Tim O'Brien's In the Lake of the Woods, which was a dual buddy read with Jason of Old Blues Chapter and Verse and Kelly of Books I'm Not Reading. They are husband and wife, if you didn't know. And what a supreme technical work of genius this is. It's about a Vietnam vet who was broken as a child, but hid it very well. Then he goes into the miasma that was Vietnam and post-traumatic stress disorder and all of that. He comes back from the war and he plunges himself into politics. He's trying to be elected a senator for Minnesota. And he's ahead in the polls, and then some of his wartime secrets are exposed. And he ends up losing the election. And to get away from it all, from the press and the furore and everything, he and his wife take up the invite of a remote cottage or shack in the lakes, and his wife disappears. That is the plot. And there are 5 possible reasons that she disappeared. One, that she just wanted to get away from it all and get away from him, so she sails off to Canada. 2, that she commits suicide by drowning. 3, that she was going for a paddle and had an accident. 4, that her husband killed her. And 5 is that no, the husband's going to follow her because they both want to get away from it, and just they want to get away from everything but their love and their relationship, and they want to sort of preserve that, but in the only way to preserve it is to do it in a different country. And all of those are equally believable. That is the skill that O'Brien weaves his tale. And he doesn't just tell it as a single narrative. There are there are sort of either real or O'Brien invented versions of the inquiry into the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, in which American soldiers basically wiped out a whole village and had rapes and things like that, and only one soldier was ever found guilty, and even he was released after a year because of the public outcry. So all that was true, and the implication is that the guy in O'Brien's novel was part of that battalion involved in the My Lai massacre. So you get this sort of factual or pseudo-factual approach of things from the My Lai hearings. You also get the witness testimonies and statements for the local sheriff in Minnesota, who's investigating the wife's disappearance. So a lot of that is told as sort of witness statements, and he also delves into people who aren't in Minnesota, like his mother and things like that. So character background on it. So there's all these different types of storytelling, but they're all woven in so majestically. It is a supreme act of skill. It's a supreme act of skill, as I say, that you don't know which of those 5 outcomes. You, the reader, almost like you're sort of conducting a hearing or an investigation yourself, you, the reader, are asked to give your verdict of what you think has happened to the wife. It's supreme. Now, the only reason I haven't made it my read of the year is I appreciated it 100% on the technical writing level, how it was all brought together, all these diverse elements. And I think I really need to read it again, just as a reader, because I've got all that stuff under my belt. I've absorbed it all and how he does it and stuff. So I wouldn't need to delve into that if I read it again. And also, and this isn't the fault, this maybe shouldn't be held against this book, but I was so impressed with it that I read another Tim O'Brien book, which was a buddy read with Brian over at Bookish, called Going After Cacciato, which we were both seriously underwhelmed by. And I think that sort of took some of the sheen off. I'd said he's such a great writer, which he obviously is, but he's produced a duff book. So unfortunately that sort of counted against him when perhaps it shouldn't. And just before I go into my stats, I just wanted to talk about a couple of non-fiction books which are up there with any of these. This is The Shapeless Unease, A Year of Not Sleeping by Samantha Harvey, and this is Lost in Math, How Beauty Leads Physics Astray by Sabine Hossenfelder. Like all of the books I'm talking about, I will put in the show notes links to the full reviews. But The Shapeless Unease I picked up because I thought it was a book about insomnia, which it sort of is, but that's not really the value of this book. The value of this book is in how literary it is and the treatment of creativity and anxiety through the literary lens that Harvey, who is a novelist, brings. So, for example, she talks about time, which is obviously a key element in writing. And she's wondering, she's discovered about an Amazon tribe who have no concept of past or future. They live purely in the moment. And she wonders if that's something she could try and work towards within the Western world, and that would lessen some of the anxieties over time that are involved with insomnia. But there's a problem in that if a tribe live without past and present, they have no stories. Then they don't acknowledge their ancestors, and that's a problem for a writer, to have no stories and not to be able to draw from the past or project into the future. So it's really interesting on that level. And Hossenfelder, as she says, how beauty leads physics astray. Hossenfelder attacks the trend in science whereby the more simple and the more elegant and the more aesthetically pleasing equation, the more that is taken to be proof in and of itself of the truth of the equation. I mean, obviously there's all the maths behind the equation that prove it, but it's given added weight and impetus somehow if there's an aesthetic beauty and simplicity. And she takes that to task and interviews a lot of the scientists who give her this response, and she goes away and tears down their arguments brilliantly. And it's something I've always felt. It's no rationale that the world has to be beautiful and elegant and simple in what underpins it. So I think part of my positive response to this is that I've always felt that, and it's nice to see it in print and with arguments rather than just my sort of gut layman's science feeling about it. So there you have it. Those are my top reads of the year. On to the stats. So I read 113 books in all, which compared with about 130 last year. 98 were fiction, 15 were non-fiction. And of the fiction, 5 were poetry collections, although depending how we categorise Anne Carson, you could possibly add 3 more, because I read 3 Anne Carsons this year, which would make it 8 poetry collections. I read 3 short story collections, and that Evan Dara book is a play script, but I think it is a novel or a novella. Of the 98 fiction books, 63 were written by men and 36 were written by female. And if you do your maths, you'll realise that adds up to 99, which is one more than the actual number of books I read. That's simply because there was a collaboration novel between Blake Butler and Vanessa Place. So I just counted 1 man, 1 female for that. Geographically, of the 98 fiction books, 28 are from the UK, which is possibly my lowest ever percentage. I think you could draw your own conclusions what I feel about UK fiction writing from that statistic alone. 37 from the US and 41 were from the rest of the world, of which 9 were from Germany, which reflects that this was the 2020 Read More German Lit Challenge. 6 were from France. Canada were 3, which were all the Anne Carson. 2 from Austria, again Read More German Lit. 2 were from Holland, 2 were from Mexico, 2 were from Australia. 1 was from Brazil, 1 was from Japan, 1 was from South Africa, 1 was from Martinique, 1 was from Palestine, 1 was from China, 1 was from Korea, and then 1 from all the following European countries: Switzerland, Russia, Croatia, Serbia, Greenland, Norway, Denmark and the Czech Republic. So those are my stats for the year. Thank you for everyone who's tuned in. I hope that's of interest. As I say, I will post full review links for each of the books I've talked about here. But I'm interested to know if, given it's a difficult reading year with COVID and everything, and where our mental energies have been throughout the year, I'm interested to know if you've had a similar experience to me in terms of reading, in that there were no standout reads, or whether you can have a definitive top 5. Obviously, I'm watching other booktubers' end of the year videos, wrap ups and things. But I'm interested to know how the reading year's gone for you. And of course, if you want to comment on any of the books I've talked about, please feel free to do so. Okay, till next time.